Around 2007 and 2008, Nvidia started shipping a generation of mobile GPUs that would go on to become one of the most infamous hardware disasters in laptop history. The affected chips included the GeForce 8400M, 8600M, and several related parts used in laptops sold by Apple, Dell, HP, and basically every major laptop maker of that era. On paper, they were solid mid-range mobile GPUs, and for a while they seemed to work fine. The problem was what happened after a few months of normal use. Chips would start artifacting, displays would flicker, and eventually laptops would just stop outputting video entirely. The cause was traced back to the underfill material and solder bumps used to attach the GPU die to its packaging. Because laptops heat up and cool down constantly during normal use, the chips expanded and contracted over and over, and eventually the solder connections cracked. This was later nicknamed Bumpgate, and it affected a genuinely massive number of laptops. Nvidia initially downplayed the whole thing, but Apple quietly extended warranties on affected MacBook Pros, while Dell and HP pushed out BIOS updates that just ramped the fans up way higher to try to delay the inevitable failure. None of that actually fixed the underlying defect. It just hid it for a little longer. Users who weren't covered by extended warranties were basically stuck with dead laptops or repair bills that sometimes exceeded the value of the machine itself. The situation eventually led to a class action lawsuit, and in 2010, Nvidia settled by depositing $2 million into an escrow fund to reimburse repairs, while also paying around $13 million in legal fees. And throughout all of this, Nvidia never actually admitted the chips were defective, insisting there was nothing wrong with the GPUs themselves. That stance didn't really hold up given the mountain of failed laptops out there, but it set a precedent we'd see again and again. In September 2014, Nvidia released the GeForce GTX 970, which quickly became one of the best-selling graphics cards of the entire decade and the most popular GPU on the Steam hardware survey at its peak. It was marketed as a 4GB VRAM card, with 64 ROPs and 2 MB of L2 cache in the official specs that Nvidia gave to reviewers and listed on its own website. The problem is, none of that was actually true. A few months after launch, users started noticing weird stuttering and performance drops when games started pushing VRAM past a certain threshold. Benchmarks confirmed something very specific. The card became dramatically slower once you tried to use more than 3.5 GB of its 4 GB of memory. After digging, independent tech outlets discovered that the GTX 970 did technically have 4 GB, but that memory was split into two segments, a fast 3.5 GB pool and a slow 0.5 GB pool, with the smaller pool running around 7 times slower than the rest. On top of that, the card actually had 56 ROPs, not 64, and 1.75 MB of L2 cache, not 2 MB. So basically, Nvidia had been advertising hardware specs that didn't match the physical product people were buying. Nvidia's CEO at the time responded by calling the memory setup an inventive way to give users 4 GB on a card that would otherwise have been a 3 GB product, which many people felt was just rebranding the problem rather than addressing it. A class action lawsuit was filed in February 2015, and in 2016, Nvidia settled by agreeing to pay each GTX 970 buyer in the class $30 plus $1.3 million in attorney fees. Buyers got pocket change, while Nvidia got to keep selling one of the most commercially successful GPUs ever made. It was a cheap resolution for a very deliberate case of misleading advertising. In 2018, Nvidia announced the GeForce Partner Program, abbreviated as GPP, which was presented publicly as a simple marketing initiative to bring clarity to gamers. The public explanation was that when you bought something branded ROG or Aorus or MSI Gaming, you should know exactly which GPU you're getting. In reality, the program had terms that were way more aggressive than that. According to reporting from HardOCP and other outlets, partners who joined the program had to keep their flagship gaming brands exclusive to Nvidia GPUs. This meant that if Asus wanted to keep using its ROG branding with Nvidia, it couldn't also use ROG on AMD Radeon cards. You could immediately see this take effect, because Asus quietly created a new brand called Ares specifically for AMD cards, and Gigabyte dropped the Aorus branding from its Radeon products as well. The issue, obviously, was that this locked the strongest gaming brands in the industry to Nvidia only, while AMD-based products got shoved under obscure new names that consumers had never heard of. This is textbook anti-competitive behavior, and critics immediately called it out. A few weeks of bad press later, Nvidia canceled the program on May 4th, 2018, in a blog post that blamed rumors, conjecture, and mistruths rather than acknowledging any of the actual concerns. Reports later suggested a big reason for the reversal was that OEMs like Dell and HP refused to sign up, not that Nvidia had a change of heart. So this is a case where Nvidia tried to use its market dominance to choke out its main competitor at the branding level, and only backed off because industry pressure made it too costly to continue. Around the same era, Nvidia got into another big mess that took years to fully unravel. Starting in 2017, the crypto mining boom caused a huge surge in demand for Nvidia gaming GPUs because miners were using them to mine Ethereum. This was great for Nvidia's revenue, but when Nvidia reported its earnings during its 2018 fiscal year, the company kept framing the massive growth as coming from gaming, without clearly disclosing how much of that growth was actually tied to crypto. When crypto crashed in late 2018, Nvidia suddenly had huge amounts of unsold inventory and had to cut guidance, and its stock dropped about 28.5% over 2 trading sessions. Investors were understandably very upset because they felt they'd been sold a misleading picture of the business. In May 2022, the US Securities and Exchange Commission formally charged Nvidia with inadequate disclosures, finding that the company failed to disclose that crypto mining was a significant element of its material revenue growth. Nvidia agreed to pay a $5.5 million penalty without admitting or denying the findings. Then years later, a class action lawsuit from investors over the same period was certified by a federal judge in 2025, meaning it can proceed to trial. Plaintiffs allege Nvidia concealed over $1 billion in crypto-related GPU revenue. Considering Nvidia's size, $5.5 million is basically a rounding error for them, but the case set a pretty clear example that even the biggest tech companies can get caught hiding where their money actually comes from. At the end of 2020, Nvidia got caught doing something that genuinely crossed a line in the tech press world. A YouTube channel called Hardware Unboxed, which is one of the most respected GPU review outlets out there, received an email from Nvidia explicitly informing them that they were being banned from receiving Founders Edition GPU review samples. The reason given was that their reviews were focusing too much on rasterization performance, which is the traditional way GPUs render graphics, and not enough on ray tracing, which was Nvidia's big new marketing feature at the time. The email said Nvidia would reconsider if their editorial direction changed. Basically, Nvidia was telling an independent reviewer to change how they reviewed products or lose access. This is a really serious thing for a company to do because review samples are how major reviewers get GPUs early enough to have reviews ready for launch day. Cutting off access is a direct tool to pressure coverage. When Hardware Unboxed went public with the email, the backlash was massive, with other reviewers including Linus Tech Tips immediately coming to their defense. Within days, Nvidia backpedaled hard, reversed the ban, and claimed it had been handled poorly. But they only walked it back because it became a PR disaster. The attempt itself made it clear that Nvidia was willing to use its position to try to shape reviewer coverage, which is exactly the kind of pressure every tech journalist is supposed to be shielded from. When the RTX 4090 launched in October 2022, it was genuinely the most powerful consumer GPU ever made, but it came with a brand new 16-pin power connector called 12-volt high power, which was designed to deliver up to 600 watts through a single small plug. Within weeks of launch, reports started appearing online of these connectors melting and destroying both the cable and the card. Pictures of charred, deformed plastic started flooding subreddits and forums. The worst part was that these were $1,600 graphics cards that were literally cooking themselves on people's desks. Nvidia initially blamed users for the issue, claiming the problem was that the connector wasn't fully plugged in and that there were only around 50 cases globally. Independent testing, especially from Gamers Nexus, showed the design itself had serious issues, including extremely tight tolerances and no margin for error in how the plug had to be seated. Even users who were experienced PC builders, who had built dozens of systems, were reporting melted cards. A class action lawsuit was filed in November 2022 in the Northern District of California. Eventually, the connector spec was quietly revised to a new version called 12-volt 2x6 with shorter sensing pins that only delivered power when the plug was fully seated, which basically confirmed the original design had a problem. But by then, a repair shop in Los Angeles called Northridge Fix was reporting it was receiving roughly 200 melted cards and adapters per month at the peak, and the issue kept popping up even a year or more after purchase on original cards. So Nvidia shipped a power connector that could melt $1,600 hardware, and for months their official answer was that users were holding it wrong. In January 2025, Nvidia launched the RTX 50 series with the RTX 5090 and RTX 5080, and the launch itself was a total disaster on the availability and marketing side. The release was widely described by major outlets like Tom's Hardware and TechRadar as a paper launch, meaning there was almost no actual stock at MSRP. Retailers had handfuls of cards, some resorted to lottery systems where you had to win the right to buy one, and prices immediately jumped well above MSRP, with RTX 5090s going for more than double the $1,999 sticker price in some regions. Micro Center, Best Buy, and Newegg all sold out within minutes of release. Then came the marketing backlash. At CES 2025, Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang claimed the $549 RTX 5070 would match the performance of the previous gen $1,599 RTX 4090. It was technically not a lie, but it only held up if you enabled the new DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, which uses AI to generate up to 3 extra frames for every one real frame that the GPU actually renders. Without AI frame generation, Nvidia later admitted the RTX 5070 is only about 20% faster than a 4070 in raw rasterized performance, nowhere near a 4090. Reviewers like TechSpot called the raw performance unbelievably underwhelming, and even shortened their review because there was so little to say about the actual hardware. The 5070 equals 4090 line got seen for what it was, a marketing claim built entirely on AI-generated frames, which is genuinely frustrating because Nvidia had a generational product launch that could have spoken for itself, and instead they oversold it so hard that the actual hardware felt like a letdown. On top of the paper launch and the misleading marketing, the RTX 50 series also had a stack of actual hardware and software problems that kept appearing for months after release. Tech PowerUp discovered in February 2025 that some RTX 5090 cards were shipping with fewer ROPs than advertised, the exact same kind of issue that Nvidia had gotten sued over with the GTX 970. The defect was later confirmed to also affect RTX 5090D, 5080, and 5070 Ti cards, and Nvidia confirmed it impacted less than 0.5% of units with an average 4% performance loss. On top of that, the melting connector issue from the 4090 came back on RTX 5090s, even though the 5090 used the revised 12-volt 2x6 connector that was supposed to fix the problem. The card just draws so much more power, up to 575 watts compared to the 4090's 450 watts, that the same fundamental design still couldn't handle the load safely. Then there were the drivers. RTX 50 owners reported black screens, BSODs, and random game crashes that were so bad that some users had to drop their PCIe interface to older standards or even lower their monitor refresh rates to 60 Hz just to get the cards to run at all. Unlike owners of previous generation cards, RTX 50 users couldn't even roll back to stable older drivers because no alternatives existed yet for the new hardware. It took multiple driver revisions, including emergency hotfixes, to address the worst of the stability issues. So basically, every single major thing that could go wrong with a GPU launch went wrong with the RTX 50 series simultaneously. And somehow it was still one of the most successful product launches Nvidia has ever had because demand was so absurdly high that none of it actually hurt sales.